Hi there, this is Ranjit, and in this first episode of Learn Camera Basics, I'm going to talk about Aperture. Again, if you have watched my earlier video about the intro of this camera learning basics series, here I'll explain to you the basics that you should know if you have a DSLR or a high-end camera. And it's ideal to use these cameras in manual mode, but to master that, first you have to know about the basics, and there are simply three basics. That's aperture, ISO, and shutter speed. And when you learn these three things, you can control the camera in manual mode. In this episode, I'm going to talk about the aperture. And again, this is determined by your lens. And aperture is nothing but by manipulating the aperture, the amount of light that passes through your lens is controlled by the aperture blades. Think of aperture as, for example, you have this is a camera lens that we have. And this camera lens will have some blades, and these are aperture blades, and these open and close inside the camera when you adjust the aperture. And by opening it and closing it, it controls the amount of light that passes to your camera sensor. And when you change that, again, it not only affects the amount of light that passes to your camera sensor, but it also affects the depth of field. And let me show you how this happens via this simple example. Now let me demonstrate what happens when you change the aperture. Do note that I've set the camera to manual mode so that it does not change the ISO or shutter speed to compensate for the change in aperture. And I'm focusing on that flower, and I've set the aperture to f2.8, the max opening of aperture for this lens. I will slowly start increasing the aperture so that you can notice the difference and notice the background blur at the lower aperture. Now I'll set it to f2.8, that's the max for this particular lens, and then we'll start increasing the same so that you can see the difference. So now it's at f2.8, and notice the background, it is having that beautiful depth of field. And now as I'm increasing the aperture, notice that the image is getting darker and darker. And the background also, if you notice closely, is going to become slightly sharper now. But again, as we are increasing the aperture, it's at f9, it's getting darker and darker because of the light that is being passed to the sensor is becoming lesser and lesser. So the aperture controls the amount of light that is being passed from your camera lens to the camera sensor. As I'm in the manual mode, the camera is not compensating with the shutter speed, but if you are just in the aperture priority mode, the camera will change the shutter speed to compensate for the aperture. So that is what happens when you change the aperture. Again, as I mentioned, as I was in the manual mode, the camera did not adjust the shutter speed or the ISO to compensate. But to make it very simple, again, pick up your camera and just go to the A or the AV mode. On Panasonic camera, it's known as A, but generally on many of the Canon cameras, the aperture mode is denoted by AV. And here you can now change the aperture. And again, when you adjust the aperture, the camera will automatically adjust the other parameters, that is the shutter speed and the ISO. So again, play around with the aperture. And for aperture, it is actually it's very peculiar. They call it f-stops. That is the amount of light that passes. And for aperture, it's known in numbers. For example, many people get confused. In general analogy, the higher the number you go, it's better. But for aperture, it's exactly opposite. The lower the f-stop, that is, let's say with the aperture of 5.6, and let's say you now set it to 3.5. The 3.5 will let in more light compared to 5.6. So for example, if you have set the aperture to f16, it'll let in very little light, but when you open it wider, let's say your lens can go up to 2.8, it'll let in more light. So that's how it works. So it's a little bit confusing, but just to make it very simple, I would say technically, many of you professionals will shout at me, but think of it as the lower f number, that is, let's say f2.8, will let in more light compared to f6 or f7. And again, I would say if you have a camera, play around with the aperture. And here are some of the examples that show you what happens when you change the aperture. I haven't changed any other settings, just playing around with the aperture. Again, I have kept it in the aperture mode for these examples. And as you can see at f11, the background also you can see clearly, but when we drop down to f2.8, you get that beautiful effect. So this can be achieved by manipulating the aperture. And again, as it's in the aperture priority mode, the camera will automatically adjust the shutter speed. So it's ideal to have it on a tripod. So to sum it up, aperture controls the amount of light that is let in by your camera lens to the sensor, and this also affects the depth of field. And that is the reason when you're taking sort of portrait shots, it's ideal to go with the lower f-stop like f2.8 or even f1.8. Many of the professional photographers have high-end professional lenses that can go as low as 1.2 to 1.4. And again, if you're taking landscape, then you want it sharp the entire picture. So increase the f-stop to about f11 or even f16. So that is how you get a very different perspective of a picture by just changing the f-stop, that is the aperture. The aperture is determined by your lens. Generally, many of the kit lens, for example, this is the Canon kit lens. This is 18 to 55 lens, and at the lowest it can go as 3.5. But again, it's a variable one. For example, at 18 it can go to 3.5, but when you zoom in all the way to 55, I think it goes up to 5.6. So again, if you have a variable kit lens, generally the aperture will be variable. You also have apertures which are constant, but those lenses are actually very expensive. For example, my Panasonic GH4 lens is a constant 2.8. That means even at this 12 it is 2.8, but even if I zoom into 35 it will stay at 2.8. So again, the lens will also determine if your aperture will stay constant or not. Generally, with the bundled kit lenses, the aperture generally changes as you zoom in, so you have to be aware of that. Also, you can also have a look at prime lenses. They have generally a very wide open aperture. For example, this is the 24 prime lens. This has a f2.8, and also there is this lens that is very popular among photographers, that is known as the nifty 50, a 50 lens that can go down up to f1.8. So this was a very quick video regarding aperture, and I would suggest, if you have a camera, take it and put it in the aperture priority mode and take pictures with the same, and change it and see how the picture looks differently. In the next episode, I'll talk about the shutter speed and why it is important, particularly for photography. So again, stay tuned to my channel, and if you're not subscribed to my YouTube channel, hit that subscribe button. Thanks for watching. This is Ranjit, and I hope to see you in my next video.